Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. The dust on Gehenna 4 tasted of rust and regret. Kalen felt it coat his tongue every time he drew a breath outside the recycled air of the Axiom Corporation containment facility. It was a fine, red grit that worked its way into the seams of his fatigues, into the seals of his boots, into the weary lines around his eyes. He had been a warden here for 3 standard years, a sentence served in the gray corridors and humming silence of a place designed to hold things the galaxy preferred to forget. His shift began, as it always did, with the low thrum of the facility's life support vibrating through the soles of his boots. The lights above were sterile, unwavering strips of synthetic daylight that knew no dawn or dusk. They bleached all color from the world, leaving only shades of metal and shadow. Kalen moved through this monochrome existence with an economy of motion learned over a decade of corporate service, first as a soldier, now as a jailer. His face, reflected dimly in the polished obsidian walls, was a mask of tired competence. He ran a hand over his close-cropped hair, the gesture automatic, a nervous tick from a life before this one. The silence here was not peaceful. It was a pressurized thing, heavy with the weight of what lay dormant behind reinforced plasteel. His rounds took him past rows of identical containment cells, most of them empty now, monuments to failed projects and extracted assets. Only a few held occupants, their designation plates glowing with cold, clinical data. His destination was the deepest part of the facility, Sector Gamma, the place reserved for the most valuable and volatile asset. The designation plate read simply, CUA 07. Containment Unit Anomaly 7. Axiom had a talent for sterile language that stripped away all meaning. They called the entity within a resonance cascade anomaly, a term that was both technically accurate and profoundly dishonest. To the grunts and wardens who had to watch over it, it was simply the ghost. The air grew colder as he approached the final blast doors. A faint, almost subsonic hum emanated from beyond, a vibration that seemed to settle deep in his bones. It was a feeling more than a sound, a sense of immense, coiled potential. He keyed in his access code, the tumblers of the magnetic lock clicking with loud finality in the quiet hall. The heavy doors hissed open, revealing the observation chamber. Inside, the room was circular, dominated by a single immense pane of armored transparency. Beyond it, in the heart of the containment sphere, floated the anomaly. Lyra. He did not know her name, not then. To him, she was just the prisoner, the reason for the facility's existence. She was humanoid in form, slender and impossibly graceful, suspended in a shimmering field of pale blue energy. Her skin was the color of pearl, and her long, white hair drifted around her as if she were submerged in water. She was still, her eyes closed, seemingly asleep or in a trance. Kalen took his post at the main console, his gaze sweeping over the rows of glowing readouts. Field integrity, energy output, biosignatures, atmospheric composition. All green, all stable. His job was to watch these lights, to ensure they never changed. For 8 hours a day, he was the guardian of a sleeping god or a caged demon, and he had long ago stopped caring which it was. It was just a job, a paycheck that kept him far from the memories he had paid to escape. He had seen footage of what happened when the containment field had faltered once, years ago. The raw data logs showed a wave of psionic force that had liquefied the internal organs of 3 technicians before the secondary systems had engaged. The official report called it a defensive reaction. Kalen, watching the silent, beautiful figure in the sphere, saw only a creature trapped and terrified. But he buried that thought. Compassion was a liability in this line of work. It was a weakness that Axiom exploited and then discarded. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the slow crawl of the chronometer on his console. He drank recycled water that tasted of ozone and ate a nutrient paste that was as gray and lifeless as the facility itself. Outside, the red dust storms of Gehenna 4 would be scouring the rock formations into alien shapes. In here, time had no texture. It was simply a state of being. He was halfway through his shift when the first flicker happened. A tremor ran through the deck plate, so subtle he might have imagined it. Then the lights in the observation chamber dimmed for a fraction of a second before brightening, with a painful intensity. An alarm klaxon blared, a raw, grating sound that shattered the oppressive silence. Red lights began to strobe across the console, bathing the room in a bloody wash. Kalen's training took over. His eyes scanned the board, fingers flying across the touch-sensitive panels. A cascade failure in the primary power conduit. The facility's ancient reactor was sputtering, starved for fuel that corporate had deemed too expensive to ship on schedule. The backup generators kicked in, but they were not designed to sustain the immense power drain of the CUA-07 field. On the main screen, the field integrity numbers were plummeting. 90%, 80, 70. The blue shimmer around the floating figure began to waver, to thin like smoke in the wind. Kalen watched as her placid form stirred. Her head tilted, and for the first time since he had been assigned to this post, her eyes opened. They were silver, pools of liquid mercury that seemed to hold a galaxy's worth of sorrow. They fixed on him, through the armored glass, through the dying energy field. He felt that gaze like a physical impact. It was not hostile. It was a silent, desperate plea. The biosignature readings spiked erratically. She was in pain. The unstable field was tearing at her, an invisible fire consuming her from the inside out. Protocol was clear. In the event of an imminent breach, Warden Protocol 117 dictated the immediate termination of the asset. A directed plasma burst, clean and final. His hand hovered over the red, shielded toggle switch. He saw her again, not as an asset, but as a living being, trapped and tormented. He saw the flicker of intelligence in those silver eyes, the tremor of agony that ran through her slender frame. In that moment, he saw all the casual cruelty of the system he served, the cold calculus that reduced life to a line item on a budget report. He thought of his own past, of the orders he had followed without question, of the things he had done for a steady paycheck. A single, defiant thought cut through years of ingrained obedience. No. He slammed his palm down, not on the termination switch, but on the manual override for the energy diverter. It was a forbidden action, a cardinal sin against Axiom Protocol. He bypassed the failing main reactor and began shunting all available power from the facility's secondary systems directly into the containment field. Life support, lighting, even the internal defense grid. He was plunging the entire sector into darkness, starving it of power, all to stabilize her cage. The console screamed at him with a dozen new alarms. The field integrity numbers wavered, then held, then began to slowly, painstakingly, climb. 55%. 60. The violent fluctuations around her body subsided. The look of agony on her face softened into something else. Her silver eyes remained fixed on him, and in their depths, he saw a flicker of something he had not expected. Understanding. A silent acknowledgement of his choice. Then the comms unit crackled to life, the voice sharp and laced with venom. Warden Kalen, what in the hell are you doing? You have violated 17 different security protocols. My board is lit up like a festival tree. It was Warden Valerius, ambitious, cruel, and a dogmatic follower of the corporate handbook. He was Kalen's immediate subordinate in rank, but his superior in political maneuvering. Valerius saw every situation as an opportunity for advancement, and Kalen's transgression was a gift. I'm stabilizing the field, Valerius, Kalen said, his voice level, betraying none of the turmoil in his gut. Your job is to follow protocol. The directive is clear. In the event of a breach, you terminate. You are compromising the entire facility. Stand down and await my arrival. That is a direct order. The line went dead. Kalen knew what that meant. Valerius wasn't coming to relieve him. He was coming to enforce Protocol 117 himself, and to write a report that would see Kalen either executed for insubordination or shipped to a penal colony where the life expectancy was measured in months. He had just signed his own death warrant. He looked from the console to the figure in the sphere. The field was holding at 70%, a fragile equilibrium. Her eyes were still on him. In that shared gaze, a silent pact was formed. He had chosen her life over his career, over his own safety. Now, their fates were intertwined. Heavy, rhythmic boot steps echoed from the corridor outside. Valerius and his security team. They were moving fast. Kalen had minutes, maybe less. His life of quiet, dutiful survival was over. He had made a choice, a single, impulsive act of defiance, and it had brought the entire weight of the system down upon him. The oppressive silence of Gehenna 4 was about to be broken by violence. The blast doors to the observation chamber began to grind open. Kalen didn't hesitate. He turned to a secondary console, one rarely used, and keyed in a sequence of emergency release commands. It was designed to jettison the containment core in the event of a catastrophic reactor meltdown. It would also, he knew, completely disengage the energy field. Containment release initiated, a synthetic voice announced calmly from the speakers. He drew his sidearm, a heavy-caliber pulse pistol, and stood his ground. The doors opened to reveal Valerius, flanked by two armored guards, their rifles leveled. Valerius's face was a rictus of triumphant fury. "Kalen, you have lost your mind. Stand down now. It's too late for that." "Valerius," Kalen said, his voice flat. Behind him, the blue energy field collapsed with a sound like shattering glass. The entity they called the ghost, the anomaly, was free. She drifted to the floor of the containment sphere, landing with impossible lightness. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Then Valerius smiled, a predator's grin. "Excellent. Now I have justification to neutralize you both." He gave a sharp nod to his men. Before they could fire, Kalen dove behind the main console, the air sizzling where he had been standing. He returned fire, his pulse bolts impacting against the guard's armor with percussive thuds. They were driven back, but it was a temporary reprieve. He risked a glance toward the containment sphere. She was standing now, looking at the scene with a strange, detached curiosity. She did not seem afraid. She seemed new, as if seeing the world for the first time. He realized with a jolt that she was a danger to him as much as to them. He had unleashed a power he could not comprehend, and now he was trapped in the room with it. Valerius barked an order. "Forget him. Subdue the asset." The two guards shifted their aim. This was the moment. Kalen's gamble would either pay off or end with all of them dead. As the guards prepared to fire stun rounds at her, she raised a hand. It was not a threatening gesture, but the air in the room grew thick, heavy with ozone. A low thrumming sound filled the space, a sound that resonated not in his ears but in the center of his chest. The guards' rifles suddenly glowed cherry red. They cried out, dropping the weapons as they melted in their hands, the plastic stocks turning to slag. Valerius stared, his arrogance momentarily replaced by shock. He drew his own pistol, but his aim was wild. He was focused on her, the source of this impossible power. "You are corporate property," he screamed, a fanatic's last defense against a reality that was crumbling around him. He fired at her. Kalen saw the bolt of plasma lance across the room and knew he had to act. He threw himself from behind the console, tackling Valerius just as he fired again. The two of them crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs. Kalen's head struck the durasteel deck, and his vision swam with stars. He felt Valerius struggling beneath him, cursing and spitting. He looked up, his head throbbing, just in time to see her move. She glided across the room, her feet barely seeming to touch the floor. She stood over the two struggling guards, her silver eyes filled with a cold, analytical light. She raised her hand again, and a wave of invisible force erupted from her palm. It wasn't an attack. It was a push. The guards were thrown back against the far wall with enough force to dent the plasteel, slumping to the ground, unconscious. She turned her attention to him and Valerius. Kalen managed to wrench the pistol from Valerius's hand, slamming his rival's head against the deck to stun him. He scrambled to his feet, breathing heavily, his sidearm trained on the unconscious men. He was alone with her now. The facility alarms were still blaring, a soundtrack to their desperate escape. She approached him slowly. He instinctively tensed, his pistol still raised, though he knew it would be useless. She stopped a few feet away, her silver eyes searching his face. He saw no malice there, only a profound, alien intelligence. She tilted her head, then extended a hand, palm up. It was an invitation, a question. He lowered his weapon. His heart was pounding, a frantic drum against his ribs. He had broken every rule, assaulted a superior officer, and freed the most dangerous entity in the sector. There was no going back. His only path was forward, into the unknown, with this silent, powerful being at his side. He gave a short, sharp nod. Together, they turned and ran, leaving the chaos of the observation chamber behind. The sterile corridors of the facility were now a hunting ground, and they were the prey. The alliance was fragile, born of mutual desperation. He was a disgraced warden. She was an escaped captive. They did not trust each other, not yet. But for now, they needed each other to survive. Their exodus had begun. The corridors were a maze of gray and white, punctuated by the strobing red of the emergency lights. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Kalen moved with a soldier's instinct, hugging the walls, his pistol held ready. She followed a pace behind him, a silent, graceful phantom. Her presence was unnerving. The air around her felt charged, and the low hum that emanated from her was a constant reminder of the incredible power she held in check. They reached a junction. A schematic on the wall showed their position relative to the main hangar bay. It was their only viable escape route, but it would be heavily guarded. This way, he muttered, more to himself than to her. He didn't know if she understood his words, but she followed without hesitation. As they rounded a corner, they came face to face with a security patrol. For guards, clad in the black and gray armor of Axiom enforcers. They raised their rifles. Kalen reacted instantly, dropping to one knee and firing 2 precise shots that took down the lead guard. The others returned fire, plasma bolts searing the air around him. He was pinned down, outgunned. He risked a glance back. She was standing calmly in the middle of the corridor, untouched, as if the bolts were parting around her. She looked at the remaining guards, her expression unreadable. Then she lifted her hand, fingers splayed. The metal wall beside the guards buckled inward with a deafening shriek of tearing durasteel. It folded in on them, not crushing them, but trapping them in a cage of twisted metal. Their panicked shouts were muffled by the wreckage. Kalen stared, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. She had bent plasteel with a gesture. She turned her silver eyes to him. He saw a flicker of something in them. Exertion. The display of power had cost her. A thin trickle of silver, like mercury, ran from the corner of her eye. She swayed slightly. He instinctively reached out, steadying her with a hand on her arm. Her skin was cool to the touch, smooth as polished stone. The contact sent a strange jolt through him, a feeling of static electricity and something deeper, a sense of shared loneliness. He pulled his hand back quickly. "We have to keep moving," he said, his voice rough. They pressed on, the silence between them filled with the distant sounds of pursuit. They found a maintenance shaft, a dark, narrow passage that would bypass the main security checkpoints. The air inside was thick with the smell of lubricant and ozone. Kalen switched on the lamp on his pistol, its beam cutting a small, nervous circle in the oppressive darkness. They moved in single file, the close confines forcing a proximity that was both uncomfortable and necessary. He could hear her soft breathing behind him, feel the faint warmth she radiated. At one point, her hand brushed against his back, and he flinched, the unexpected touch a stark contrast to the cold, hard reality of their flight. The shaft eventually opened into a storage depot adjacent to the main hangar. Kalen peered through the grating. The hangar was swarming with Axiom security. In the center bay sat a single, mid-sized transport, a Kestrel-class courier, likely Valerius's personal ship. It was their only way off this rock. "It's too hot," he whispered. "We'll never make it across the open floor." She moved beside him, her gaze fixed on the scene below. She touched the grating with her fingertips, and he felt a faint vibration run through the metal. Then she looked at him and pointed toward a series of massive cargo containers stacked near the far wall, close to the Kestrel. Her meaning was clear. A diversion. He nodded, understanding. He took a spare power cell from his belt, a volatile piece of equipment if overloaded. He set its charge to critical, a makeshift bomb. "When I set this, we'll have about 30 seconds. We run for the ship, no matter what." She met his gaze and gave a single, slow nod. Her trust in him was a heavy weight. He didn't know if he had earned it. He slipped out of the shaft, moving like a wraith through the shadows at the edge of the depot. The guards were focused on the hangar entrance, expecting them to come from the main corridors. He reached the power conduits for the hangar's magnetic cranes, wedging the power cell into the junction box. He activated the timer and scrambled back. "Now," he breathed, grabbing her arm and pulling her from the shaft. The explosion was more spectacular than he had anticipated. The conduits blew, sending a shower of sparks and a wave of concussive force across the hangar. The magnetic cranes, their power cut, dropped their multi-ton loads. A container filled with refined or crashed onto the hangar floor with a cataclysmic boom, sending guards scattering. Chaos erupted. In the confusion, Kalen and his silent companions sprinted from the shadows, weaving between pieces of machinery, heading for the Kestrel. Alarms blared, and shouts echoed through the vast space. They were halfway to the ramp when a plasma bolt struck the deck at Kalen's feet, sending him stumbling. He looked back. Valerius stood on a gantry above them, his face contorted with rage, a fresh plasma rifle in his hands. He was flanked by a squad of elite enforcers. Nowhere left to run. Kalen, he bellowed, his voice amplified by the hangar's acoustics. Kalen shoved her toward the ship. Go. Get the ramp down. He turned, raising his pistol, laying down covering fire to buy her time. It was a futile gesture. He was one man against a dozen. A bolt clipped his shoulder, spinning him around. The pain was a hot, searing knife. He gritted his teeth, staggering but keeping his feet. He saw her reach the ship's access panel. The ramp began to lower with a hydraulic hiss. But it was too slow. Valerius and his men were descending, closing the distance. Kalen knew he wasn't going to make it. He fired his last shot and prepared for the end. Then, she turned back. She stood on the ramp of the Kestrel, her white hair whipping around her in an unfelt wind. She looked at Valerius, and her face, for the first time, showed an emotion Kalen could recognize, a cold, focused anger. She raised both hands, and the entire hangar began to groan. Metal shrieked. The very structure of the building seemed to cry out in protest. The gantry Valerius stood on twisted and buckled. He and his men cried out in alarm as their platform collapsed, sending them tumbling to the deck below, a fall that would injure but not kill. She hadn't aimed to kill them. She had simply removed them from the fight. The effort, however, was immense. The silver blood now flowed freely from her eyes and nose. She collapsed to one knee on the ramp, her body trembling. Kalen, ignoring the fire in his shoulder, ran to her. He scooped her up in his arms. She was impossibly light, and carried her into the ship. He slapped the control to raise the ramp and sealed the inner door just as plasma fire began to pepper the hull. He half-dragged, half-carried her to the cockpit and deposited her in the co-pilot's seat. He strapped himself into the pilot's chair, his wounded shoulder screaming in protest. His fingers flew over the console, bringing the ship's systems online. The engines whined to life. Through the forward viewport, he saw Axiom vehicles swarming the hangar, trying to block their path. Hold on, he grunted. He slammed the throttle forward. The Kestrel surged ahead, its landing gear shearing through the flimsy barricades. He pulled back on the yoke, and the ship lifted, its nose pointed at the massive hangar doors. They were closing, too slowly to trap them, but fast enough to be a problem. He fired the ship's forward cannons, blasting a hole in one of the doors, and steered the small ship through the gap. They were out. The red, dusty sky of Gehenna 4 surrounded them. But they were not safe. The facility's orbital defense batteries would be online in moments. He pushed the ship into a steep, evasive climb, pushing its engines to their limit. Warning lights flashed on his console. A targeting lock. Beside him, she stirred. She reached out a weak hand and placed it on the console. A soft, silver light spread from her fingertips, flowing into the ship's systems. The targeting lock alarm went silent. On his screen, he saw the incoming missile veer off course, as if chasing a ghost signal. She had interfaced with the ship, confused its sensors. They broke through the thin atmosphere into the blackness of space. Below them, Gehenna 4 was a wounded, red orb. Kalen set a course for the densest part of the nearby asteroid field, a place where they could lose any pursuers. Only then did he allow himself to slump back in his seat, the adrenaline fading, leaving only the throbbing pain in his shoulder and a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He looked over at his co-pilot. She was slumped in her seat, her breathing shallow, the silver trickles on her face stark against her pale skin. He had saved her, and she, in turn, had saved him. Twice. The bond between them was no longer just about survival. It was forged in mutual protection, a debt of life paid and repaid in the fire of their escape. He didn't know who or what she was, but he knew he was responsible for her. His flight from his past had ended. A new, far more dangerous journey had just begun. The Kestrel drifted through the silent asteroid field, its engines running at minimum to mask its heat signature. Kalen had engaged the autopilot and turned his attention to their injuries. His own was a clean plasma burn, painful but not life-threatening. He patched it with a dermal regenerator from the ship's medkit, hissing through his teeth as the sealant knitted his flesh back together. Her condition was more alarming. She remained unconscious, her breathing faint. The silver liquid had stopped flowing, but it stained her skin like tears. He didn't know her biology, had no idea how to treat her. All he could do was make her comfortable, covering her with a thermal blanket. He sat in the pilot's seat, watching her, the silence of the cockpit a stark contrast to the chaos of their escape. They were fugitives. Axiom would hunt them relentlessly. She was too valuable an asset to lose, and he was a traitor who had to be made an example of. Their only hope was to disappear, to find a corner of the galaxy so remote that even the corporation's long reach could not find them. He plotted a course for the Outer Rim, a lawless expanse of forgotten colonies and pirate havens. Days passed. He kept the ship running on a skeleton crew of automated systems, catching sleep in short, restless bursts. He spent most of his waking hours in the cockpit, watching the starfields drift by and watching over her. On the third day, she awoke. He was reviewing sensor logs when he heard a soft stirring beside him. He turned to find her silver eyes open, watching him. There was a lucidity in them that had not been there before. She sat up slowly, pushing the blanket away. "How are you feeling?" he asked, the words sounding clumsy and inadequate. She did not answer, at least not with words. She raised a hand and pressed her fingertips to her temple. He felt a sudden, disorienting sensation in his own mind, a whisper of thought that was not his own. It was not a voice, but a series of images, feelings, concepts. A query. Where? He was so startled, he leaned back in his chair. Telepathy. Of course. Why would a being of such power be limited to spoken language? He tried to focus his own thoughts, to answer her question. He visualized a star chart, their current position, their intended destination in the Outer Rim. He felt a wave of something from her. Not gratitude, precisely. Acknowledgement. Then, another series of images flooded his mind, sharp and painful. A green world, bathed in the light of twin suns. Crystalline cities that sang with a silent music. A people who looked like her, their forms shimmering with a gentle, internal light. It was a vision of paradise. Then, the vision soured. Dark, angular ships blotted out the suns. Axiom ships. Fire rained from the sky. The crystalline cities shattered, their music turning into a scream of psychic agony that echoed in Kalen's own skull. He saw her people dying, their light extinguished. He saw the planet's surface cracked open, its core mined for a glowing, volatile energy source. And he saw her, a lone survivor, being herded into a containment field, her grief a weapon that lashed out and was mistaken for mindless aggression. The vision ended. Kalen gasped, clutching his head, the phantom echoes of that psychic scream still ringing in his ears. He looked at her, his heart pounding. He finally understood. She wasn't an anomaly. She was a refugee, the last of her kind. Axiom hadn't discovered her. They had committed genocide and taken her as a trophy. Administrator Forlag, the ruthless head of Axiom's Special Projects Division, had personally overseen the operation. His face, cold and cruel, had been burned into her memory. She was watching him, her silver eyes searching his face, gauging his reaction. He saw the raw pain in her, the weight of 1 billion lost souls. He had spent his life serving the architects of that pain. The nutrient paste in his stomach turned to acid. He unstrapped himself and walked to the small galley, needing a moment to process the horror of what he had seen. She followed him, her movements silent. He leaned against a bulkhead, the cold metal a small comfort against the heat of his shame. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling hollow. "I was one of them. A soldier. I followed orders. I didn't know." She came to stand before him. She looked at the fresh scar on his shoulder from the plasma burn. Then, her gaze dropped to an older scar on his forearm, a jagged white line from a shrapnel wound he'd received during a corporate pacification campaign years ago. A memory he had tried to bury. She reached out a slender finger and gently traced the line of the old scar. As she did, Another image flared in his mind. It was his own memory, seen through her eyes. Him, younger, terrified, lying wounded on a battlefield, his comrades dead around him. He felt the pain, the fear, the crushing despair of that moment. But as seen through her, the memory was different. It was stripped of his own self-pity and anger. It was just a wound, a shared experience of pain. She pulled her hand back and showed him her own skin. It was flawless, perfect. But as he looked, she projected a feeling into his mind, the ghost of 1,000 scars, the memory of her world dying, the agony of her people being ripped from existence. Her wounds were not on her skin. They were etched onto her soul. In that moment, the last of the walls between them crumbled. He was no longer her warden, and she was no longer his prisoner. They were two survivors, scarred by the same enemy, bound by a shared trauma. He looked into her silver eyes and saw not an alien, but a kindred spirit. A new resolve hardened within him. This was no longer just about running. It was about justice. It was about making Axiom pay for what they had done. He didn't know how, but he knew he could not spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. He straightened up, his course set. "They called your world Xylos," he said, the name coming unbidden from the memories she had shown him. "What did your people call you?" She touched her own chest, and a single, melodic thought entered his mind, a name that felt like starlight and silence. "Lyra." "Lyra," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. It fit. He met her gaze, his own determination reflected in her silver eyes. "All right, Lyra. Let's give them a reason to remember your name." Their flight became a hunt. Kalen, using his knowledge of Axiom's networks, began to reach out to old contacts, disillusioned soldiers, and information brokers who lived in the gray margins of the galaxy. He traded data from the Kestrel's logs, information on Axiom shipping lanes and secret projects, in exchange for supplies, fuel, and intelligence. Lyra was his partner in this. She could sift through encrypted data streams, her mind navigating firewalls and security protocols as if they were not there. Together, they became a thorn in Axiom's side, a ghost in their machine. They exposed black sites, leaked incriminating files, and disrupted supply lines. They were a two-person insurgency, fighting a guerrilla war from the cockpit of a stolen courier ship. The corporation's response was predictable and brutal. Administrator Forlag, enraged by their defiance, put a massive bounty on their heads. He dispatched his most ruthless agent to hunt them down, Warden Valerius, now promoted to commander, given command of a state-of-the-art pursuit vessel, the Harbinger. The cat-and-mouse game escalated. They had several close calls, escaping traps and ambushes by the thinnest of margins. Kalen's piloting skills and tactical acumen were pushed to their limits. Lyra's powers grew, or rather, her control over them refined. She learned to weave illusions, to jam communications, to manipulate the very systems of the ships that pursued them. They fought a running battle through the gas clouds of the Crimson Nebula. The Harbinger was faster, better armed, and relentless. Valerius seemed to anticipate their every move, his obsession with capturing them bordering on mania. Plasma fire crisscrossed the swirling red and purple clouds. The Kestrel's shields buckled, its hull groaning under the punishment. "He's hurting us," Kalen said, his hands tight on the controls as he dodged another volley. "He's pushing us toward the gravity well." Lyra sat beside him, her eyes closed in concentration. She was fighting a silent battle, pushing back against the Harbinger's attempts to hack their systems. Silver sweat beaded on her brow. "He is angry," she projected, her thought laced with the cold fury she sensed from their pursuer. "His pride is wounded. He makes mistakes." She was right. Valerius was so focused on the kill that he was overextending, pushing his ship's systems to the breaking point. Kalen saw an opening. He cut the engines, letting the Kestrel fall into a wild, uncontrolled spin, feigning critical damage. As he had hoped, Valerius took the bait. The Harbinger surged forward, its forward cannons glowing, preparing for the final blow. Just as the enemy ship passed over them, Kalen fired the thrusters, flipping the Kestrel and positioning them directly beneath the Harbinger's unprotected engine block. "Now, Lyra," he yelled. Lyra's eyes snapped open. She placed her hands on the console, and all the power she could muster flowed into the Kestrel's comms array, repurposed as an energy weapon. A focused beam of raw, concussive force, invisible to the naked eye, erupted from the ship and slammed into the Harbinger's engines. There was no explosion. The enemy ship simply died. Its lights went out. Its engines fell silent. It was a dead hulk, drifting helplessly toward the nebula's gravity well. They had won the battle. But as the adrenaline faded, a grim reality set in. Kalen brought up the long-range sensors. A massive fleet had just translated from hyperspace at the edge of the system. At its head was a ship that dwarfed the others, a behemoth of a vessel, Axiom's flagship dreadnought, the Indomitus. And on its bridge, Kalen knew, would be Administrator Forlag himself. Their small victories had only angered the beast. Forlag was no longer content to send his minions. He had come to finish this himself. The screen flashed with an incoming message, a system-wide broadcast. Forlag's face appeared, cold, patrician, and utterly confident. To the fugitives aboard the stolen courier, he began, his voice smooth and menacing. You have caused my corporation a great deal of inconvenience. This ends now. Surrender the anomaly, and the man, Kalen, will be granted a swift, painless death. Resist, and I will sterilize this entire nebula. Your defiance will be met with utter annihilation. Kalen looked at the tactical display. They were hopelessly outmatched. The Indomitus alone could destroy a small moon. The fleet surrounding it could pacify a star system. There was no escape. There was no victory. The war, which they had fought so hard, was already lost. He looked at Lyra. She was staring at the image of Forlag, her expression a mixture of grief and hatred. He felt her despair, a cold wave that washed over him. They had come so far, only to be cornered like this. The weight of their unwinnable war settled upon them, heavy and suffocating. It was then that she showed him the final, terrible truth. Her mind reached out to his, not with images of the past, but with a vision of the fundamental nature of her power. She was a being of resonance, a living amplifier of life energy. But the weapon Axiom had used to shatter her world had done more than just kill her people. It had created a wound in the fabric of space-time, a discordant frequency that was slowly, silently, poisoning the sector. Her own power, untethered from the collective consciousness of her people, was unstable. It was drawn to this wound, amplifying its dissonance. If she were to die, especially in a violent explosion like the one Forlag was threatening, her energy would be released all at once. It would rush into that wound and ignite, causing a chain reaction that would unravel reality itself for light years in every direction. Forlag, in his ignorance, was threatening to unleash an apocalypse. There was only one way to stop it. The wound had to be healed. The dissonance had to be silenced. Her power needed a new anchor, a consciousness that could willingly merge with her energy and ground it, turning the chaotic cascade into a stable, silent harmony. This merging had to happen at a focal point, a place where the connection to the wound was strongest. The vision cleared, and Kalen was left with one stark image. The containment chamber back on Gehenna 4, the place where it had all begun. The solution was impossible. A sacrifice. Someone had to become a living seal, to give up their identity, their very being, to be subsumed into an eternal, silent guardianship, to become a part of Lyra, a part of the planet, a part of the silence. He looked at her, the understanding passing between them without a single projected thought. She could not do it alone. Her will was not enough to contain her own power. It required an outside consciousness, a partner, to complete the circuit. The impossible choice was laid bare before him. His life, his consciousness, for the lives of billions. It was not a choice at all. A strange calm settled over Kalen. He had spent his entire life running, first from the wars Axiom had sent him to fight, then from the memories of those wars, and finally, from Axiom itself. He had lived a life defined by survival, by self-preservation. He had no family, no home, nothing to leave behind but a string of regrets and a stolen ship. He looked at Lyra, at the last survivor of a murdered people. He had started this chain of events with a single act of compassion, a refusal to follow an inhuman order. It seemed fitting that it should end with a final act of sacrifice. His life had been empty of meaning. In death, or whatever came after, it could mean everything. He thought of the red dust of Gehenna 4, of the sterile gray corridors, of the quiet hum of the containment field. He thought of the moment her silver eyes had first opened and looked at him, not as a warden, but as a person. His path had been leading here all along. The internal conflict, the debate he should have had, never came. The decision was already made, settled in the deepest parts of his soul the moment he understood what was at stake. This was not an end. It was a purpose. He reached out and took her hand. Her skin was cool, and he could feel the faint, thrumming energy beneath it. He met her gaze, and for the first time, he projected his own thoughts toward her, clear and unwavering. "I will do it." He felt her response, a wave of profound sorrow that washed through him, so deep it threatened to drown him. But beneath the sorrow, there was acceptance, and a gratitude so immense it had no words. She knew the cost. She had been asking him to join her in a silent eternity, and he had not hesitated. He turned back to the ship's controls, his movements deliberate. He opened a channel to the Indomitus. "Administrator Forlag," he said, his voice steady. "We are surrendering." He could almost feel Forlag's smug satisfaction across the void. "A wise decision, Kalen. Proceed to the designated coordinates. Power down your weapons and prepare to be boarded." "We have one condition," Kalen continued, ignoring him. "We will surrender, but only on Gehenna 4. In the primary containment chamber. We will walk in ourselves. You will have your asset back, unharmed." There was a pause. Forlag was suspicious, but his arrogance won out. The idea of his escaped prisoners returning to the very cage they had fled from appealed to his sense of irony. "Very well. A fitting end to your little rebellion. Proceed to Gehenna 4. My fleet will escort you." The channel closed. Kalen set a new course. Back to the beginning. Back to the red world where his life had irrevocably changed. Lyra placed her hand on his arm. He looked at her. Her silver eyes were shimmering with unshed, mercury tears. He offered her a small, sad smile. There was nothing left to say. They had made their decision. Now, all that remained was to see it through. The Kestrel, flanked by a fleet of warships, turned and began the long, final journey back to Gehenna 4. The descent through Gehenna 4's atmosphere was a silent, solemn affair. The Axiom fleet hung in high orbit like a pack of metal vultures, their presence a suffocating weight. Kalen guided the Kestrel down toward the familiar scar on the planet's surface that was the containment facility. He landed the ship gently in the same hangar they had escaped from, its damaged doors still gaping open like a wound. The ramp lowered. The air that greeted them was still and cold, carrying the faint, metallic tang of the red dust. Standing there, waiting for them, was Commander Valerius. He was flanked by a squad of Axiom's elite shock troops, their armor gleaming under the harsh hangar lights. Valerius's face was a mask of cold triumph, though Kalen could see the burning resentment in his eyes. "Welcome home, traitor," Valerius sneered. "The administrator is watching. He wants this to be done by the book." Kalen and Lyra walked down the ramp. He had left his pistol on the ship. He was unarmed, his hands empty at his sides. Lyra walked beside him, her expression serene, a stark contrast to the barely contained violence of the soldiers surrounding them. "Take us to the containment chamber," Kalen said, his voice flat. They were marched through the facility, their footsteps echoing in the now silent corridors. The strobing emergency lights had been replaced by the steady, sterile glow he remembered. It felt as if no time had passed at all. They were ghosts, walking back through the scenes of their own past. They reached the final blast doors leading to the observation chamber. Valerius shoved Kalen forward. "After you." The chamber was just as he had left it, though the signs of their previous battle had been cleaned away. The armored glass was intact, and beyond it, the empty containment sphere awaited its prisoner. Valerius and his men stayed in the observation room as Kalen and Lyra walked into the sphere itself. The air inside felt different, charged with a latent energy. This was the focal point, the heart of the wound. "Seal the chamber," Valerius ordered. The transparent portal irised shut, trapping them inside. Kalen could see Valerius's smug face through the glass. He was savoring this moment. "You should have just followed your orders, Kalen." Valerius's voice crackled over the internal calm. "You could have had a long, profitable career. Now, you get to die watching me put this thing back in its box." He gestured to his men, who began working at the control console. Kalen ignored him. He turned to Lyra. "This was it. The final moment. She looked at him, her silver eyes filled with a universe of unspoken gratitude. She reached out and placed her hands on his chest. He covered her hands with his own. Are you ready? Her thought was a soft whisper in his mind. I am, he sent back, his own thought clear and calm. On the other side of the glass, Valerius frowned, seeing their quiet intimacy. What are you doing? Power up the field. Full intensity. Lyra closed her eyes. The power began to build within her, a force that Kalen could feel resonating in his own bones. The air grew thick, and a pale, silver light began to emanate from her, bathing the sphere in its ethereal glow. The lights in the facility flickered and died as she drew all available energy into herself. Valerius hammered on the console. What's happening? Contain it. The light intensified, growing almost blinding. Kalen felt a searing heat spread through his chest from her hands. It was not a burning pain, but a transformative fire. He felt his physical body begin to dissolve, his atoms unwinding, his consciousness expanding beyond the confines of his skull. He was dimly aware of Valerius, in a panic, overriding the safeties and drawing his own weapon, firing shot after shot at the transparent wall, which held firm against the onslaught. But it was all distant noise, fading into the background of a much greater reality that was opening up to him. He saw everything. He saw the birth of Lyra's people from the cosmic dust. He saw their silent, symbiotic dance with the galaxy. He saw the arrival of Axiom, the greed, the violence, the shattering of a world. He saw his own life, a small, brutal, lonely path through the darkness. He saw the moment he chose compassion over protocol. His consciousness merged with hers. Their two histories, two sets of memories, became one. He was Kalen, the jaded soldier, and he was Lyra, the last star of a dead constellation. He was the wound, and he was the healing. The pain of his dissolution was immense, but it was overshadowed by a feeling of profound, absolute peace. He was no longer just a man. He was an anchor. He was a guardian. His last coherent thought was not of himself, but of the balance he was bringing. He was giving his name to the silence. Then, there was only light. On the bridge of the Indomitus, Administrator Forlag watched the monitors as the energy readings from Gehenna 4 went off the scale. Then, every screen went white. A wave of energy, faster than light, erupted from the planet. It was not a destructive blast. It carried no heat, no radiation, no concussive force. It was a wave of pure information, of pure feeling. It washed over the fleet. On the bridge, men and women stumbled, clutching their heads. They were not in pain. They were drowning in a sudden, shared understanding. They felt the joy of the Ethel's birth, the horror of their extinction, the lonely desperation of Kalen's life, and the solemn peace of his sacrifice. They saw their orders, their careers, their entire lives through the lens of this absolute truth. The will to fight, to conquer, to obey, simply evaporated. It was replaced by a crushing, soul-deep shame. The gunner who had been about to fire the orbital cannons slumped over his console, weeping. The tactical officer stared blankly at his screen, seeing not ships, but ghosts. Forlag was immune. His mind, so wrapped in narcissism and greed, could not process the wave of empathy. He saw only that his crew had stopped functioning. "What are you doing?" he roared. "Fire! Obliterate that planet!" No one moved. His first officer turned to him, his face pale, his eyes filled with a terrible clarity. "No, sir. No more." The wave of peace washed over the facility on the surface. Valerius, screaming in rage and terror, fell silent, his face a mask of sudden, horrified comprehension. The fighting stopped. The war was over. 10 years passed. The Axiom Corporation was no more. Shattered by the mass desertion of its fleet and the subsequent leaking of a generation's worth of incriminating data, it had collapsed under the weight of its own atrocities. The Gehenna incident, as it came to be known, had sent shockwaves through the galaxy, forcing a reckoning that had reshaped the political landscape. Gehenna 4 was now a memorial, a protected world under the jurisdiction of a new galactic charter. The system was a silent, peaceful place. No ships were allowed within a light year, save for one small vessel that made the pilgrimage once every standard year. An old man stood in the observation chamber, looking into the containment sphere. It was Corbin, Kalen's former director, now retired. His face was a roadmap of weary lines, but his eyes were clear. The sphere was no longer dark. It pulsed with a soft, steady, silver light, a gentle, rhythmic beat like a sleeping heart. The air in the facility was calm, peaceful. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt watchful and kind. On the wall beside the armored glass was a simple plasteel plaque. It did not bear a name or a rank. It had only a single, short inscription. He gave his name to the silence. Corbin reached out and placed his palm against the cool surface of the glass. He closed his eyes. He felt no psychic projection, no voice from beyond. He felt only a profound sense of balance, a presence, a quiet, eternal guardianship that held the darkness at bay. Kalen was gone, and yet he was everywhere. He had become the peace that he had fought so hard to find. The old man stood there for a long time, a silent vigil for the warden who had become a savior. He then turned and left, the soft, silver light of the eternal heart pulsing behind him, a silent testament to the cost of peace and the enduring legacy of a single, defiant choice.